Hey, what's going on everyone? Welcome back to the Fire Emblem character guides. Today we're tackling Radiant Dawn, which is probably the best game for these kind of guides because you can really see the difference between what I'm doing here, a character guide, and what I normally do, which is making tier lists, because this game is noticeably, infamously terrible for tier lists because availability is all over the place, characters leave and join your armies all the time, and characters that are good in one part tend to be pretty bad in others, so giving a character a single character rating in one tier list, in one summary, it just doesn't work. You can't give a character a rating on their whole performance because their performances vary so much. So instead of doing something different, I'm splitting them all up. So I'm only going to talk about two parts in this video. I'm going to talk about the Dawn Brigade parts, so that's part 1, and then their maps in part 3. So that's 3.6, 3.12, and 3.13. I'm only going to talk about that. I'm not going to talk about part 4. And if I have time, which I think I will, I also prepared one for part 2, so that will also be in this video. So it's going to be the Crimean Royal Knights part. That one is going to be fairly short because it's pretty self-explanatory. So you get all characters in this game pretty much in part 4, but that's like a whole different story that I want to like dedicate an entire video to. So I'm going to leave that out for now. I'm going to stick to just Dawn Brigade and the characters you have in part 2, which is mostly Alincia's entourage and like the Crimean Royal Knights and stuff. Real quick, you've probably already noticed there's one character missing from this list. Because these videos are aimed at first-time players who want to get into hard mode, like this is specifically about hard mode. I'll talk a little bit about the difference between hard mode and normal mode in a second. I'm trying to leave out spoilers as much as possible. So there's one like spoiler-like character. I will name him, I think, after I'm done talking about all the characters on here, so that people who don't want to get spoiled can just skip that part. Because I think it's a pretty cool plot twist that they did, and they didn't want to just ruin it for someone. Even though I'm talking about hard mode, which is not available for first-time players usually, but you might have like a save file to get into, or you might be interested in normal mode, or you might just be listening. You might already know what I'm talking about. Anyway, let's get into it. So I try to mostly stick to the categories I use for auto tier lists, which means no-brainer are characters you should pretty much always use. Good investment, which is units that they don't start out spectacular or anything, but they can keep up with the difficulty curve. You can train them and they'll become good eventually. Good temporary is a little different in Radiant Dawn. I decided for this tier, this category, I keep fucking it up, but it's a category. I'm only going to put units here that will leave your army at some point. After part 1, all these units will be gone, but while you have them, they are good. That's basically the summary. So basically, I'm saying don't train these units, but use them to your advantage when you do have them. Then I made like an extra tier for Laura because I have no idea what to do with her otherwise. She heals people. That's pretty self-explanatory. You should use her when you can. And then I put high effort people. These are people that you can train. I know at least one placement here is going to be a little controversial, but after using him for quite a bit and looking over his stats like a couple more times, I do feel like he belongs in the high effort tier. But of course, as always, you can train every one of these units and be fine. In hard mode though, I would really recommend against it. I would recommend you stick to like 1 or 2 trained units, maybe 3, and everything else just use the pre-promotes that you get, because that's kind of what they're for. And if you spread your XP too thin, then you're going to have a really bad time in part 3 and having a harder time catching up for part 4. So I recommend picking like 2 units is probably the ideal amount out of the good investment part and the high effort part that you like to train, and focus your XP like hard into them, and that will make sure they can reach promotions early. It will let them keep up with enemies better. You can give them more bonus experience because you have less spread around, because hard mode is really stingy with its XP. So currently in my run, I am training Nolan, Jill, Kaya I gave a bunch of XP to, Leonardo I tried to train, Aaron I trained, so I picked way more than I'm giving advice for now, and it's actually hurting me. It's not like I can handle it because I know the game pretty well, but I wouldn't recommend it. So I recommend you pick a low number of people to invest in. That's one of the first advice I'm going to give for hard mode. Normal mode, easy mode, they are a lot more generous with bonus experience and XP gain in general. So you can just kind of do whatever you like there, train more units. I've seen units reach promotions like way earlier in easy and normal mode. So if you're playing that mode, then I wouldn't worry too much about that. But for hard mode specifically, I do recommend what I call low manning. It's focusing your XP on a low amount of units. So let's start with the no-brainer part real quick. So Soth is basically a Jig, and you kind of think of him as FE6 Marcus, where even though he does fall off eventually, like at some point he does become worse. At least in part 1, there is no reason to not use Soth. I wouldn't train him. It's kind of weird with Soth because his bases are very good and his growths are very good too. Like, he's got good strength and speed growths. But in the long term, he's just not that viable. In part 1 though, he has high mobility, he has 1 to range, he has thief utility, he can set up kills for others, he can get a support bonus from Akaya. He's really dodgy, he's pretty durable for the most part of the game, and only like around 1 end game will he start to like feel a bit worse. He might not double some faster enemies, he might actually have a chance of dying at some points, but you're really making yourself like, you make it really hard on yourself if you're not using Soth whenever you can. And like, again, I wouldn't feed him kills, I would use him to set up kills for others, or take out like a bunch of tough enemies in 1 enemy phase to just give everyone else some more breathing room. Because if you're going to try to feed every kill to units like Nolan or units that are in the high effort tier, it's going to be a very miserable experience for you, and it will also let you miss out on bonus experience if you're not going fast enough. So yeah, I recommend using Soth to your advantage when you can. In part 3, he is a lot more fragile. Most of the enemy types, at least the Lagoos in that part, will 2-shot him. He has a chance to kill them with a Beast Killer because that's high crit, or he might double them, and that can be helpful situationally, but the no-brainer part is mostly part 1. You can think of it as like, Marcus in the early game of FE6 is very good, but at some point you kind of want to like stop using him a lot because it doesn't actually feel good. Like a trained Nolan or Jill or even Zyhark or some of your pre-promotes will be more useful than Soth in the part 3 maps. So this is mostly a recommendation to really make use of him in part 1, and in part 3 use him when it's like advantageous, but it probably won't be as often. And part 4, which we'll get into later, he's going to be absolutely terrible, but I'll get into that in part 4. Volug is a no-brainer because just like Soth, he joins way stronger than most of your team, so there's no reason to use him. And unlike Soth, he actually keeps up pretty well in part 3. When he joins, he first has Wild Heart, and he just doubles everything. And even though his transformation bonuses are halved due to Wild Heart, he is still very strong. His HP is high, he doubles everything. He usually 2-hit KOs enemy types that are not like armor knights, and he only really has to watch out for like mages, especially fire mages. But as long as you're a bit careful, Volug pretty much just cannot die. If he does die, you get a game over just like with Soth, so you have to be a little bit careful. But usually people reset when people die anyway, so it doesn't matter too much. The point is, Volug is like a more mobile, I guess you could say, pre-promotes. He's a Lagoos, but they gain XP pretty slowly. It is recommended, if you like him long term, you might want to train up his strike rank, and that means just letting him get attacks in. It doesn't matter if he kills or not. I actually recommend not killing with things for him. And just like, if you can set up a kill for Nolan with Volug, I recommend doing stuff like that, because that means Volug gets 2 strike rank, which will eventually let him gain, when he goes to S rank strike, he'll gain more might on his weapon, so that's good for him. But even if he kills an enemy, he's just going to gain 1 experience point, so you might as well just have him weaken enemies and have Nolan finish him off. But again, just like with Soth, if you want Volug to kill enemies just to make things easier on yourself, don't feel bad about it, just do it, it's fine. Have him kill enemies if it makes things easier for you. But, you know, if everything else is the same, if it's just about, like, do I want to kill with him or not, there's no one else nearby who can get this kill, just get to kill the Volug and it's fine too. But yeah, do recommend using these 2 a lot in part 1. And in part 3, use Volug. Take Wild Heart off of him though, by the way. In part 3, you want to use like a Leafy Grass. You can also, if you want to be like really advanced, you might be able to steal a Lagoon Stone from Mordecai or Leth in part 3. Because you do face them in 3-6, but that's kind of tricky. I wasn't able to do it in my playthrough because I was just tanking at the starting point, so maybe not recommended for new players, but that's something you can do. Relying on Olivia Grass is fine. Then we have good investments. I only put 3 units here because I think these are the only 3 units I would actually like full-heartedly recommend people use for hard mode. Again, this is just for hard mode. If it was like normal or easy mode, I would drag some of the people up here. Like the first person I would drag up here is Aaron. I think he's not that tough to train, but I want to make it clear in this tier list, like trying to train Aaron in like hard mode is not as easy as training these guys. I'm also kind of torn on Zyhark because he's not someone who needs XP in part 1, but I also don't want to put him in temporary because it doesn't leave you, and then like, I don't know, it's kind of weird. So I put him up here for lack of a better tier for her, but this is mostly about units like Jill and Nolan that I think they start off good enough to where you want to train them and they have no trouble keeping up, and then in part 3 they make good use of the resources you have to snowball out of control and become really good. So these 2 resources I'm talking about are Paragon and Beastfoe. I find Nolan is very good with Beastfoe in part 3, and he actually has the might to get one-hit KOs on enemies, and he has the bulk to survive a bunch of them. And because he gets one-hit KOs, he doesn't need to finish off enemies on player phase, which means you can use his turn to heal. And I find that very, very useful. So that's why I think Nolan is one of the better units, and that's also what distinguishes him from Aaron, in my opinion, is that ability. And also just the fact that he just starts with more HP in general. Like usually Aaron and Nolan have like somewhat similar bulk if they're both raised, depending on like what stat boosters you give them. So, but come part 3, I think that advantage of being able to one-hit KO enemies using Beast Foe is big enough to like warrant Nolan going up here. But yeah, Nolan starts off stronger than most of the other units, but he's not like a pre-promote, he's like a level 9 fighter. So his bulk comes in handy in the early chapters, and because of that, it's not hard to keep up with all and keep feeding him enemies. He's one of the few people who can fight on enemy phase. As more and more temporary units come in, there will be less need for Nolan to tank things, but he can still do it if you need him to, and that already makes him like much more easy to train than the units that I put in this category. So that's why Nolan deserves to be up here, I think. He's good to invest into. His growths are alright, his bases are alright, he'll keep up. You should be able to promote him by the end of part 1 at the very least. Similarly for Jill, she's your only flyer for most of the part. The only other one is Vika, and she's not nearly as useful as Jill is in the long term, if only because Vika doesn't stick around. So Jill is just really good. Again, using axes is nice. She's a good user of Paragon. She joins at a pretty high base level, so you can promote her whenever you want with a Master Seal, or keep giving her levels so that she can level like strength and speed. She has some durability issues. I think Jill and Nolan, for this reason, are also the best recipients of stat boosters. You get an Angelic Robe, a Draco Shield, and an Energy Drop. Some people think I like to give these all to Jill, and I do, but I reckon that if you're using Nolan or even Aaron, then it's fine to give them stat boosters as well, because they use it pretty well. And I like stacking the stat boosters on the same person, because if you give someone a Draco Shield and an Angelic Robe, they kind of compound each other and let them take some more risky enemy phases. So that might be something that might be interesting. It's just stacking them either on Nolan or on Jill. Again, I like Jill because her HP starts kind of low, but I can see it working on Nolan as well, especially because then you get the benefit from Draco Shield earlier. I recommend throwing them all on Jill, but it doesn't really matter. I do it also because I like Jill. Like, no bias here, none at all. Okay, so Zyark is weird because unlike these two, he's a pre-promote, but I still think he's an investment unit for the long term, especially because of part 3 and part 4. But in part 1, he's honestly like kind of like some of these units where he doubles everything, he kills everything. His durability is like not as good as his offense, but it's still pretty good, between like adepts and high avoid rates and reasonably high HP and not getting doubled. Like his durability is like above average for part 1. Part 3, it kind of takes a nosedive because the enemies will two-shot him no matter what. Whereas Nolan and Jill, for example, and Aaron are able to get to the part where they can like get 3-shot or even 4-shot by some enemies, depending on like whether they're cats or tigers. Zyark has some trouble reaching those benchmarks, like a lot of trouble actually. Like even with like a single robe or a Draco Shield, I don't think he can avoid being 2-hit killed by tigers. Maybe like tiger plus cat, he might be able to survive that, but generally I think he has trouble surviving. And that makes him less of a like investment unit, I think. I think that makes him harder to use in part 3. The problem is not killing Lagoos. He can do that just fine with like a Brave Sword and maybe a Adept procs or some crits or maybe Resolve. But doing so safely is difficult because if he, like, imagine you're choking a point with Zyark, he can survive one enemy and they come up to him. And if he's able to one-round KO them on enemy phase, that sounds good at first, but that leaves a spot open for another Lagoos to come in and maybe finish him off. And because it's not reliable, it's based on like crits and Adept, you can't count on him doing it, but you also can't count on him not doing it. So that makes the safest option to actually like unequip him, and that's pretty terrible for a unit that you're mostly wanting to use the offense of. So he's kind of awkward to use in part 3, and his avoid isn't going to help him either, because even though he has an earth affinity, and even though there's like thickets around you can hide in, it's still never going to be reliable enough to actually risk his death. So for that reason, Zyark can be tricky to use in part 3, especially chapter 6 and chapter 13. But he has his uses. I didn't want to put him down here, but if I had an extra tier for like units that are like good temporary but they stick with you, I would maybe put him in here. I do think it can work part in like long term because he does have the earth affinity, so if you give him a support with Volug or Nolan, you get double earth and eventually become like an avoid tank. But I think in part 3, unless you're playing very slowly, he's not going to be able to make it to like a beast support, which is I think what he needs to get like a reliable avoid. And even if he gets there, like in part 3:13, you do have to deal with enemy leadership. So yeah, it's a little dicey. I've never really had great experiences using Zyark in the long term. He can work in part 4 though. We'll talk about that when we get there. Then we have good temporary, and for these units it's like very simple. Use them when you have them to take advantage of them, but when they're gone, and that's just kind of how it is. So they leave at the end of part 1, all of these. Some of them come back earlier than others. You'll find it out when you find it out. But since I'm not getting into part 4 here, we won't talk about it too much. Ilyana's only around for part 1 and she leaves for the Greil Mercenaries actually, so we don't want to train her for the Dawn Brigade, I do believe. I think that's a bad idea. So I wouldn't invest into her. When she gets to the Greil Mercenaries, she's actually like one of the worst units there. Well, she's an okay unit in the Dawn Brigade, not great, but I would use her in chapter 3 and chapter 4 and then chapter 5, and then as it goes on, like the higher the number of the chapter, the less my recommendation and enthusiasm is for Ilyana and the Dawn Brigade, and in endgame she's already like completely outclassed. But use her while you feel like you have the room for her. Have her hit some stuff at range, that can be nice, but don't feel bad about benching her because she's not that great. Tyronio is around for 2 part 3 maps actually, in addition to his part 1 appearance in 1.6. Ridiculously powerful unit in 1.6, kills everything, doesn't ever die. There's like one guy can hurt him with a hammer and that's about it. It's ridiculously hard to like get Tyronio killed, so use him as much as you like, while still maybe feeding kills to other people. But yeah, he's ridiculously strong and you should always take advantage of him. Like, he's stronger than Sotha and Volu combined, basically. He's ridiculously strong. And in part 3, he's not as invincible anymore, doesn't double everything, but he's still useful for choking points in 3.12 and 3.13. So use him while you have him. Probably not a great long-term training prospect, otherwise he would be up here. He can be useful as like a filler in part 4, but generally I would not recommend using Tyronio for anything but just like crowd control, basically. Keeping your units alive, having a unit in a good starting position in 3.12, that kind of stuff. Tormod and Muarim and Vika, they are only around for 1.7 onwards and then they leave after part 1 is over. And Tormod and Muarim are just ridiculously strong units at base. Tormod is like a Zyhark with 1-2 range, I feel like. Comes with celerity. You can take it off him. I usually keep it on him for the swamp map and then take it off for endgame. Definitely don't forget to take that off him. Same for Resolve on Tyronio, by the way. Take that off him before he leaves. You can take it off after 1.6, don't worry about it, he's still in the base. So yeah, take celerity off of him at some point, and use him to your advantage again, just kill enemies, double enemies, 1-2 range mage, super powerful, kills a lot of stuff. Durability, a little suspect, but still like above average for part 1. Muarim, even stronger than Tyronio, like even more attack power, I would believe, like ridiculously fast, murders everything in sight. His only drawback is having to transform. But in 1.7 he joins transformed, and then in 1.8 you can give him like Olivia Grass, can transform in 2 turns, and he will just destroy everything in sight. Like, he's a freaking tiger, he will destroy everything. Vika doesn't destroy everything, but flight might be useful in 1.8. That's really all I use her for generally, is like flying around in 1.7 and 1.8, and then just kind of ditch her. Her attack power is not as good, and she's very fast, and that's really all there's to it. So these two are ridiculous, Vika less so, but I'd still use her when you have her, because she's basically free. And rescue dropping people can be useful occasionally, but I don't think she's worth the Olivia Grass it takes to transform her usually. But depends. She's okay. She's alright. Nyla is like Muarim, but she doesn't have to transform. She just has form shift, kills everything right away. The Goose Royals are ridiculous in this game. Use her in 1.8 and 1 endgame, definitely. I mean, she's forced deployed in the Fortimer. You would never not use Nyla. Like, she's ridiculous, but she's temporary, so if you have a choice on who to give the kill to between Nyla and Nolan, give it to Nolan. But other than that, don't worry, have Nyla to murder everything. Raphael is a refresher, a dancer. Always use these. I usually put these in no-brainer, but because he has the same availability as Nyla, I thought it was fitting to put him here, just to indicate that you don't keep him. Thought I'd make that clear. And yeah, these refreshes 4 people at a time. It's hard to use properly in some maps because it can be kind of cramped and there's not that many units near him in his joining chapter, but definitely useful to refresh 4 people at a time. So when he's there, he's a no-brainer. That goes for most of these, honestly. They're no-brainers when they are around. I just want to indicate that they're temporary. And that unit I'm not talking about, by the way, is also a good temporary. You should also use whenever possible, but spoilers. So yeah, use that unit. You know who I'm talking about. Use him when you got him. Super powerful. I'm not going to talk about who it is. Then there's Laura. Laura is like, it's kind of like using Sarah and Ellen and stuff. Having a healer is nice, just making sure that people can use their turns for something that's not using a vulnerary can be super useful. Laura is very fragile though, so you have to protect her really well to keep her alive. But it's worth it because she just makes sure people don't have to spend their time using vulneraries. And also healing is just cheaper than vulneraries in a way, so that can be useful. But don't count on Laura to promote anytime soon. Her leveling is super slow since XP on stats is still not as good as getting XP from combat, especially when part 3 rolls around. So if she stays unpromoted for a long while, don't worry too much about it. You might want to give her a Master Seal in like part 3 somewhere if you have one to spare. But if she stays unpromoted, I wouldn't worry too much about it. It's just keep her away from enemies, far away from enemies. She's allergic to enemies looking at her, but healing is useful, and it always will be. But I wouldn't worry about her becoming like a long-term combat unit. She's just not made for that. Then we have the high effort tier. Again, these units are usable. They're not completely unusable, but it takes more effort, and especially in hard mode, it might not be something you want to do in your first playthrough. If you feel up to the challenge, go for it, but if not, don't. Micaiah is an odd one though, because in part 1 she feels like a high effort unit. She only promotes at the end of part 1, no matter how much XP you might pour into her, and no matter what you do, unless you get really lucky with her like HP or whatever, she's gonna have bad bulk, she's gonna have bad defense, she's gonna have bad speed, and she's just gonna die to everything. She's not gonna OHKO anything except armor knights and cavaliers. Thani can be good against those, so sometimes you can set it up in a way that makes Thani good enough to use, but most of the time it probably won't be. Yeah, that's really Micaiah. Like, I tried to train her in my current run, and I'm still like, yeah, it's not really working out. The support to Soth is nice, though. Sometimes it's nice to keep her near Soth to give Soth a boost to his attack and avoid, because they get a free 8 support, kind of like Louise in Penton at 7. So that can be useful. Try to use that whenever you can, especially if you're like 1 or 2 points over one running. It can be a big difference maker. In part 3, Micaiah is promoted and she can actually use staves. So in part 3, I would actually like do it like this. Just say, okay, she's a staff bot. She uses like Physic and Torch, and I don't think there's Purge, but either way, she has some more utility in part 3. So for part 3, it's more like she can heal. But I just wanted to put her here to indicate like she's not a great target for XP unless you just really like her and you want to feed her kills. But while it seems doable at first when you have like a low amount of units, as the game goes on, it will become harder and harder. That's like a theme for these units. Like the same goes for Eddie and Leonardo. When they first join, you kind of have to use them because of lack of alternatives. But once you do have alternatives, like the temporary units here, they feel very outclassed, and the only reason to keep using them is because you like them and you want to train them. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it is harder than, you know, training these units, these good investment units. So keep that in mind. Edward is like, he has the same drawbacks as Zyhark, where sometimes he kills an enemy in front of him when you don't want him to, and then the next enemy comes up and murders him because he gets 2-shot by everything. That's annoying, it happens. You can kind of try to circumvent it with like clever unequips or making sure his weapon is too weak to kill even with a crit. But it's just extra finagling you have to do to keep him alive. And he needs so much XP just to promote compared to like Nolan and Jill, and especially Zyhark because he's already promoted, that it's like, I can't say it's worth it unless you really like him. So yeah, that's my verdict on Edward. Leonardo's a bit of an odd one, where with some investment he can become somewhat useful. So what I did with Leonardo in my last playthrough is I raised him to level I managed to get him to like 7 or 8 by the end of the part 1, and then for part 3 I gave him enough bonus experience to reach level 10, and then promoted him with a Master Seal, so he became a sniper. And what you can do from there is, if you want to, you can give him a crossbow and beast foe, and he can start like doing a bunch of damage to Lagoos. I think he can one-shot with it. The reason I didn't do it is I wanted to put beast foe on one of my other characters, so I decided, you know what, I'll just make Leonardo a sniper and leave it at that. But that can be something you can do. There's some flying enemies in, I think 312 and 313. Definitely in 313. I forgot there's like enemy Pegasus Knights in 312. I think there is. We can shoot those down, and that can be pretty useful. And I've heard it can even be useful in part 4 with that build. So without any like super high amount of investment, just enough to get him to level 10, he can be useful. But as like a proper growth unit, like if you want to like train him properly to level 20 and then promote him and then use him like full time and actually give him kills and stuff, then he's more like a high effort character. So that's why I put him here. That's if you train him normally. Just like the way you'd use Edward and Micaiah and Nolan and Jill and stuff. If you use them like that, yeah, it's going to be high effort. So I wouldn't recommend that. Water Affinity, although, is very nice. He gives someone like more attack and defense. That's useful. I support him with Nolan in my playthrough, and I kind of like that. More attack and defense is always welcome on your other units. Very concrete boost, very universally useful. Aaron, again, I know I might get a lot of flack for putting him in high effort instead of good investment, but I really do believe that there's a significant gap between how much you get out of these if you invest into them, and then maybe him, but I went into him earlier. Mostly Nolan and Jill compared to Aaron. I do think Aaron doesn't really add very much to your playthrough. But if you do train Aaron, you do get a pretty tanky unit that can take hits. He won't be able to want to kill enemies with Beast Foe, so he won't grow as fast as Nolan or Jill, but nonetheless he is usable, just like everyone else. But this is not a tier of unusable units, it's a tier of units that you can use, but they will just take more effort. If you do use Aaron though, I recommend you ditch one of these characters, obviously, because training all of them is going to be a big pain. It will lose out on some bonus experience. You'll spread your XP more thinly if you don't. So yeah. Also, I would recommend keeping aside the Angelic Robe, or at least the Draco Shield for him to make him more tanky, because his base HP is very low, but because his defense is kind of high, increasing his HP is going to be more helpful than increasing his defense. It's kind of like the same thing in like Pokemon EVs, right? Someone like Blissey, you give it more defense EVs, so you would give her a Draco Shield, I guess. And if you have like a Pokemon with low HP but high defenses, like, I don't know, Dusknoir or something, you would give it more HP, because you want to raise the lower stat. And it's the same in Fire Emblem. It kind of works the same way in my book. So yeah, stacking like the Angelic Robe with Draco Shield works on him as well, of course. And Energy Drop would also work, I guess. I like the Energy Drop better on Jill, obviously, like I said before, but it could work on him. Like if you're training him long term, I'd recommend some kind of investment to actually make it work. Without investment, he's going to be much worse. And Meg and Fiona are just kind of meme units that I would never recommend anyone train, except for the challenge of it. I think pretty much everyone knows they're kind of joke units combat-wise. Meg is like... She joins in Chapter 4 as like an armor sword with no better weapons to go with, and a lot of the XP investments and not a whole lot of return on it. So not recommended, but she can work, I guess. At least she's immune to critical hits if you keep Fortune on her, which I also would recommend. I recommend taking Fortune off of her and selling it, so that's also not a big boon. So yeah, Meg good, but not really. And then Fiona, I think is... I think she's useful for like risk dropping people, but that's just really it. I would never train her. She joins at like level 9 in part 1, chapter 6, no 7 basically. And every chapter she's in is basically like a movement penalty chapter for her. Like either it's a swamp that she can't even go to actually, so like part 3 swamp, or ledges are around, or she's indoors, so there's more movement issues. She has trouble everywhere, so just use her to rescue drop. I like her to like block ledges in 313 in particular. That's pretty useful on her. So for all these units, there's like a part of the game where you want to use her to shove people, to block ledges, to chip damage, just because they're force deployed. So I'm not saying no, never use these units. I'm just saying use them when you can, kind of like the temp units. But when you can ditch them, you know, feel free to do it, and only field them if you feel like you need to. That's kind of like the whole story of the Dawn Brigade. Is everyone is sort of useful at some points in the game, but there's only a couple units that I would recommend using for like the long term, like you would use a normal Fire Emblem unit. Like it's very different from like FE7, where it's like, okay, Kent is good for the whole game. Like from the moment you get him to the end, you want to invest into him and keep using him. Radiant Dawn doesn't have that many units like that in the Dawn Brigade, at the very least. There's only like a couple of them. That's what I would recommend. But again, you're free to do whatever you like. Let me get part 2 ready for you guys. So, as you can probably see, there's a lot of units in part 2 that are kind of like the temps in part 1, where it's like, okay, you should probably use them when you have them. I mean, you can take advantage of them, like this whole squad over here. But when the time comes to ditch them, or when either the game will ditch them for you, or they will just not be as good when they rejoin, and you can actually use them for a long term. Like there's only one unit in here that I say would be good long term. I guess there's 2 or 3, it depends on how you look at it, but these are no-brainers, so I put them up here. I'll get into that in a little bit. Let's just take it from the top. So Har is a no-brainer. I think his reputation speaks for himself. He's a good growth unit that has really, really good bases. It's like I put him in like my top 15 best units of all time. There's no reason not to use Har. He's ridiculously powerful, great recipient for the speed wings that you get in part 2. You have to get like a killer halberdier into the 2-3, but it's worth it. Really bulky, really strong, enough speed to double with some investments, and flying and axes and really high strength. Yeah, super good all around. Would never recommend anyone not use Har. You can't put him anywhere but a no-brainer. I'm 100% sure I could have just called this tier the Har tier. I could even make like a tier above this that says Har, because that's just how good he is. Cannot recommend using him enough. Alincia and is more like a special case. She's really here mostly for her performance in 2 Endgame. I don't think she's like a no-brainer in 2 Prologue, but 2 Prologue is kind of like a whatever chapter where you just have to stay alive and do nothing. I'm just putting her here to show that, like, okay, when you have Alincia, you should try to like use Men's whenever you can, and you should kill things with her in 2 Endgame, because she's just really good with Yamidi. Her XP gain from combat is very poor because she's a tier 3 unit at base, whereas the enemies you fight are tier 1 or 2, so don't really have to care about giving her kills, but she's just very, very strong, and the immediate endgame is really, really powerful, like a brave sword that is going to hit people 4 times and just kill them before they can even attack sometimes. Alicia's pretty good as an investment and as a temporary unit, so that's why she's up here in no-brainer. But in 2 Prologue, obviously she's nothing special, because all she has there is a stem sword, but healing with her is pretty good. And then Yan just kind of, this is dancer. That's all there is to it. Obviously she leaves, but in part 2 everyone leaves at some point, so I didn't feel like I should put her in temporary. She dances for 2 people at a time, either vertically or horizontally next to her, and that can be kind of tricky to work with, but once you get used to it, you'll find it's pretty intuitive. So make use of it whenever you can, especially in the prologue. It's easy to do because everyone else is Kanto. So yeah, I would always just dance for Har and Valencia on that one, and then the Lucia chapter, just dance for the most powerful units, and you'll be fine. Yeah, the Herons are all really good in this game, so you can't really go wrong with those. Nephany is the only unit in part 2 that I think is worth investment besides Har. You could argue like maybe Marcia or some of the units in here are maybe worthy of being up there, but I think Nephany stands out above them. Why is that? Well, she rejoins the Greil Mercenaries earlier than all these other units, like the Crimean Royal Knights, for example, the group with Joffrey. They only rejoin in like 310 basically, 311 I think. So that's kind of late in part 3. Nephany rejoins in 3-2. And the other units that do that is like Braum, but Braum isn't as good. And then like the Laguz join in like 3-4, but they're not really investment units. So for that reason, I think Nephany is like the far best investment. Is Nephany super good? No, I wouldn't say she's as good as Nolan or Jill or Zyhark, but she does have reasonably good speed to the point where she can double enemies, and there's not a whole lot of Greil Mercenaries that double reliably, but there are some of them. And Nephany is also like in a unique position where she can take advantage of some of the resources you get in part 2 that other units can't really make use of. She's much better in normal mode and in easy mode than she's in hard mode, but I still think she's like better enough than these units as a long-term investment that I thought it was good to give her a tier of her own. But she's a bit odd one out. I'm not going to say Mia. She's not like, when she gets into the Greil Mercenaries, she's not going to be as good as Ike or Mia or Har, or even like Gatri or Titania or Oscar or something. But she's still competent enough to where I think it's worth putting her in good investment. But she's the only one, as far as I can tell. The rest are really just temporary units. You either got units that just don't grow very much, like Niluchi or Mordecai or Leth. They just don't get much XP because they're Laguz. Or you have units that just aren't available enough to like raise reasonably, and that will just be too far behind when they actually do join the Greil Mercenaries. That's Marcia and Kieran and Makalov and Danved and Khalil. They just rejoin very late. If you want to raise one of those units, by all means go ahead. I would pick one that you like the most, and in 3-9, when you have to use them for like one chapter in part 3, give him Paragon and try to give him as much kills as possible. And then when they rejoin the Greil Mercenaries, like give him some more favoritism, like bonus XP or something. That might let them catch up. So that's for Marcia, Kieran, Makalov, Danvet, and Khalil. I'll definitely plan to do that, but it's definitely still a bit high effort. A bit. Less effort than Astrid, that's why she's in a tier of her own. That's why she's in here. It's possible. And also they're just good in the chapters that are around for part 2, but not recommended for long term. Braum, like I said, is got the same availability as Nephany, and that's a good thing. Same availability as Heather while we're at it, but he's an armor knight, he's kind of slow, he's not as good as combat, so I put him like a tier lower. I'm sure you can make him work if you want to, but his speed is really low. He's not going to double anything, and his movement isn't much worse. Like 5 is a lot worse than 6. So not highly recommended as a long-term unit, but as a temporary unit, especially in the chapter where he joins, you're obviously going to need to use him. So Mordecai is good. I like using him in part 3 to smite people, but I don't really like him as a training project. He's very bulky. He's got a lot of strength, but not enough speed to double, unless you like manage to get him into resolve range or something and give him resolve. That could be an option, but generally I don't recommend training Mordecai much. The Tiger Gauge is nice though, it's better than the Cat Gauge. But Mordecai is just not very good at actually killing enemies in one round. So I just like his bulk, and I like smiting people. Lucia is literally only around for one chapter until part 4. Use her in that chapter and then never again, unless you like her as a filler. She's not completely terrible in part 4, but just use her when she joins, but treat her like a Jagan. Just kill everything you want to make it easier, but don't go ahead feeding her kills, because it's not going to do anything for you. She doesn't gain much XP anyway. And then I got Leth, and well, she rejoins you early in the Greil Mercenaries, but like I said, Laguzes don't grow very much, so just take advantage of her when you have her in 2 Endgame and 2, like the chapter with Lucia. Treat her like a pre-promote, basically the same thing. In Joffrey's charge, you have Marcia, as well as Joffrey, Kieran, Makalov, Danvet, and Khalil. Or you don't have Khalil, actually, you just have the Royal Knights themselves. So they are, how do I put this? They're useful in that chapter, but in that chapter you want to like not kill enemies to get bonus experience, so their combat performance you don't even really care about it too much. There is an area when I want to kill the enemies just to get it out of the way. The last part of Joffrey's charge is pretty hectic, and for that one you want enemies to be dead, so for that purpose arming Kieran and Joffrey is going to be very helpful. They're going to be very good in that part of the game. They can also be around in endgame of part 2, but they don't really do very much there. And then after endgame is over, Joffrey disappears until like part 4, and the other Crimean Royal Knights you won't see them again until 3.9, so you won't see them for quite a while. And in 3.9 I do recommend, well actually Joffrey's around in 3.9 too, but in sorry I said it wrong. In 3.11 you get Kieran and Makalov and Dunvet and Khalil and Marcia back, but not Joffrey. That's the big distinction between them. But Joffrey's like your best unit when you first get him, and Kieran's like second best, so use them as much as you like. And these guys, they're less good, but I would still use them when you can. Khalil joins into endgame, useful for meteor chip, useful for ranged attacking, keeping a ledge, everything you want. She cannot heal in this game until she gets to 3rd tier, so that's something she misses out on. And then she doesn't rejoin until 3.9, and then in 3.11 she's actually properly with you. I might recommend training her away her meteor at the end of 3-9, so she doesn't spam it when she's an NPC in 3.10, because that lets you conserve the meteor for your own benefit. That can be kind of helpful. And on that note, I do recommend any items from part 2 that you want to keep around for the Greil Mercenaries. Give them to Har, Nefany, Brom, and Heather. And that way it'll be transferred to the Greil Mercenaries. And that's, for most good items, that's advisable, because in part 3, the Crimean Royal Knights will not rejoin the Greil Mercenaries until 3.11, and they won't be able to use the items until 3.9, whereas the Greil Mercenaries can make use of them between 3.2 and 3.9. So something like the Talisman that you get in 2.1, stuff like that, you want to trade that to Nefany, Har, Brom, or Heather, because they transfer over to the Greil Mercenaries. So yeah, that's what I would go with. Yeah, Astrid is really weak when she first joins, and she stays that weak until you raise her up. She does join with Paragon, but because the joining chapter she's in, Joffrey's Charge, encourages you to not kill enemies by giving you bonus experience for it, I would recommend you don't go out of your way to feed Astrid kills on that one. And it probably means she's entering like 3.9 at base level, and at that point she's going to be really, really weak. Like these guys, they can sort of hold up in that chapter, but Astrid is just all sorts of terrible in that one. So yeah, Astrid is one of the hardest units to raise in this game. Again, still doable, you can still do it, but I wouldn't recommend it. And then Heather, I put her in here because Thief utility is a thing in this game, and combat utility is not a thing that she does in this game, unless you really, really have to. There's a lot of like good stealable items and hidden items in the game, like hidden treasure, that she has a higher chance to find. There's an arm scroll, there is an energy drop that you can steal in 3.5. There's a lot of stuff for her to steal. Part 2 of that Thief utility doesn't really come out a whole lot, because there's not that much to steal. There's like a Draco shield in 2 endgame that you might want to steal, and there's some like stuff you can find on the ground, but not a whole lot of it. Heather in combat is going to be a bad time, because Knives has low might, her strength is very low, her durability is not that high, and her avoid, it's like her best thing, but it's not reliable at all. So I wouldn't recommend fighting with Heather unless you really, really enjoy that kind of thing. So that's why she's in special utility. Alright, that was a mouthful. So that's what I would do for part 1 and part 2. If I were you, so now you know roughly how to use everyone. And I think Radiant Dawn, again, it really thrives on this kind of format for guides, because the tier list doesn't really show you how to like use a unit properly, and it's more about like comparing units, how they're useful throughout the whole game, and you just have to compare apples and oranges a lot. In this kind of thing where you can actually like divide the units over different tier lists, it's much better to like, it's much more instructional, and it just works out much better. So that's why I did it like that. So yeah, that's the guide for Radiant Dawn. Next time I'm gonna tackle the Greil Mercenaries. That'll probably be like an entire video, and then after that I'm gonna do part 4, and that'll probably be just like part 4 and end the game, and that's gonna be the whole thing. So look forward to that, and after that we're gonna continue with another game. Let me know where you want me to go next. Probably defaulting to either Genealogy or Shadow Dragon. As a reminder, I did make one of these very, very early on for Thracia, so I already have one for FE5 if you're looking for one of those, and I obviously already made ones for FE6, 7, 8, and 9, so go check those out if you haven't already. I'll see you around. Peace, goodbye.